The town of Harlan's Creek, Montana, had made up its mind about Clara Denton before she was old enough to have made up her own. It had decided when she was 11 and corrected her schoolteacher in front of the entire class, not rudely, not with any intention to embarrass, but simply because the man had the date of the Battle of Fort Laramie wrong, and Clara knew it, and the error bothered her in the specific way that errors bother people who cannot let them stand. The teacher had not appreciated it. The town had noted it. By the time she was 16 and already running the books for her father's lumber operation, while he recovered from a back injury that kept him in bed for 6 months, the town had formed the collective opinion that Clara Denton was, in the particular vocabulary that small Montana towns applied to such situations, too sharp for her own good. This was not said as a compliment. She was 26 now, in the autumn of 1883, and she ran the Denton Lumber Company with a precision that made the suppliers from Billings uncomfortable, and the buyers from Great Falls quietly grateful, because Clara Denton did not make errors in contracts, did not allow terms to slip past their deadlines, and could read the grain of a pine log and price it accurately by sight in the time it took most men to find their pencil. She had taught herself land law from a borrowed copy of a Montana Territorial Statutes book because a neighboring claim holder had tried to dispute the eastern boundary of the Denton yard 3 years ago, and she had needed to know, and there had been no lawyer in Harlan's Creek who would take her seriously enough to explain it to her. She had won the boundary dispute. The claim holder had not tried again. She was 5 feet 8 inches tall, which was not remarkable in the way that 6 feet would have been, but was enough. Enough to meet most men eye to eye. Enough to be noticed walking into a room before she said a single word. She had dark brown hair she kept braided back with the practicality of someone who worked outdoors in Montana, wind, and gray eyes that her father called river eyes because they were the color of the Clark Fork in winter and about as easy to read. She had been spoken to by 2 men in the manner of courtship. The first was a timber buyer from Helena who had come through on a purchasing trip when Clara was 22 and had spent 40 minutes at her supper table, explaining to her what the lumber market would look like over the next decade, apparently under the impression that she did not know. She had let him finish. She had then explained, with the particular quietness of someone who does not need to raise their voice to be clear, that she had been managing timber contracts since she was 19, and that his projection for spruce pricing was off by a margin that would cost him significantly if he acted on it. He had left the following morning and had not sent a follow-up letter. The second was a rancher's son from 20 miles east who had told her, with what Clara supposed was intended as warmth, that a woman who understood numbers the way she did would make a fine wife for a businessman. She had asked him, sincerely, whether he was proposing that she do his accounting. He had said he hadn't quite meant it like that. She had said she supposed not, and had wished him a good evening, and that had been the end of it. Harlan's Creek had its conclusions, delivered the way all small-town conclusions were delivered, not in one pronouncement, but in the slow accumulation of 100 small comments, the particular lowering of voices when Clara walked past a conversation, the way the women at the church socials would invite her and then not quite include her, because Clara Denton said what she thought and knew what she knew, and that combination made people uncertain where to put her. Clara had her own conclusions about this, which she kept largely to herself, because she understood that saying them aloud would only confirm the town's opinion. Her conclusion was that Harlan's Creek had mistaken her willingness to be alone for an inability to connect, which were different things, and that the people who found her too sharp were, in the main, people who would have benefited from being a little sharper themselves. She was not bitter about it. She was something more useful than bitter. She was clear-eyed, and she had work, and the work was good, and the Clark Fork ran clean and cold behind the lumberyard, and the Montana mountains did what Montana mountains do, regardless of what any town thought about anything. But she was not. If she sat with it honestly in the evenings when the yard had gone quiet, and the account books were closed, and the last light came off the mountains in a way that was almost too much to look at, not entirely without wanting. There was something she had not found. She could not have named its shape exactly. She had stopped looking for it in Harlan's Creek. She was wrong about that. He arrived on a Tuesday in September. His name was James Whitaker, and he had come to Harlan's Creek because the Montana Territorial Land Office had sent him. He was a land surveyor, 34 years old, employed by the federal government to resurvey and formally document claim boundaries in a region where the original surveys from the 1860s had been done hastily and were now causing disputes at a rate that required someone to go sort them out. He carried a theodolite and a set of chain measures and a leather satchel full of prior survey records that were, he had discovered upon review, a mess. He had been sent to Harlan's Creek first because the Denton Lumber Company held the most extensive private land claims in the immediate territory, and because the territorial office had been told that the Denton operation kept accurate records. He walked into the Denton Lumber Company office on a Tuesday morning at 9:30. Clara was at the drafting table by the window, reviewing a delivery manifest against a supply order she had received the week prior, because the numbers did not match, and she intended to know exactly where they diverged before she sent the response letter. She heard the door and looked up. He was not what she had been expecting, which was a government man in a city coat who would treat her like the receptionist and ask to speak to whoever was in charge. He was lean and weather-worn in the manner of someone who spent the majority of his working life outdoors, with sun-darkened forearms, and the kind of posture that comes from years of looking through survey equipment at fixed points on distant ridgelines. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and quiet eyes the color of creekstone, and he held his hat in his hand the way people hold hats when they are in no hurry and have no performance to put on. He looked at her the way people look at someone they are actually paying attention to. "Miss Denton?" he said. "That's right," she said. She set down the manifest. "You're the surveyor from the land office. James Whitaker," he said. "I understand you keep the boundary records for this operation." "I do," she said. "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker. I'll get them." She did not ask if he wanted coffee. She got the records. He sat down across from the drafting table and did not look around the office with the slightly surprised expression that men sometimes got when they registered that the space was organized and functional and clearly managed by someone who knew what they were doing. He simply waited, with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting on accurate information, rather than rushing toward an approximate version of it. She set the records in front of him. He opened them and was quiet for a moment, going through the first several pages with the focused attention of a man who reads documents the way she did for what is actually there, not for what he expects to find. "These are thorough," he said, not with surprise, as a simple observation. "The eastern boundary dispute in 1880 taught me not to be approximate," she said. He looked up. "The Holbrook claim?" She paused. "You've done your background." "I read the territorial dispute records before I came," he said. "You cited a section of the 1864 Homestead Act amendment that most practicing attorneys in Montana hadn't pulled up yet." "The amendment was in the appendix," she said. "Most people don't read appendices." "I do," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He had gone back to the records. She picked up the manifest she had been reviewing. They worked in the same room for 2 hours, each on their own materials, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people who do not need to fill space with noise to feel that something worthwhile is happening. He came back the next day, and the day after that. The resurvey of the Denton claims was extensive and required, he told her, at least 2 weeks of cross-referencing the existing records against the physical measurements he was taking in the field. This was true. It was also true that James Whitaker found reasons to be in the Denton Lumber Company office that extended beyond the strict requirements of his federal assignment, and that he found those reasons without particular difficulty. Harlan's Creek noticed, because Harlan's Creek noticed everything. By the end of the first week, it was known that the government surveyor was spending considerable time at the Denton operation. By the middle of the second week, it was noted that he and Clara Denton had been seen eating lunch on the yard's south fence on 2 separate occasions, the kind of lunch that is sandwiches from the general store, and a shared view of the mountains and conversation that appears to have no particular endpoint. By the end of the second week, the town had formed its opinion, which was that James Whitaker either did not know about Clara Denton's reputation or had not been given a sufficient account of it. Several people considered it their responsibility to give him a sufficient account. It was Ruth Alderman who ran the post office and knew more of Harlan's Creek's business than anyone else, and was, it should be said, genuinely fond of Clara in the complicated way People are fond of those they have never quite known what to do with it. Was Ruth who said it most directly. She said it on a Thursday afternoon when James came in to collect the weekly packet from the land office, and she said it with the sincerity of someone who believed she was performing a service. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, handing him the envelope. "You've been spending time at Denton's." "I have," he said. "The survey work is there." Ruth looked at him over her spectacles. "Clara Denton is a good woman," she said. "Nobody would say otherwise, but she is not an easy woman. She has opinions about everything, and she does not keep them to herself, and she has sent away 2 men already, and most people around here have concluded that she is—" Ruth paused, selecting the word. "She is simply not suited for partnership." James Whitaker looked at Ruth Alderman for a moment. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Alderman?" "Of course," she said. "In your experience," he said, "does Clara Denton say things that are wrong?" Ruth opened her mouth and then closed it. "Well," she said, she tends to be accurate, yes." "Then it seems to me," James said, picking up his envelope, "that the problem isn't that she has opinions. It's that her opinions are right, and some people find that inconvenient." He tucked the envelope under his arm. "I've spent 2 weeks reading survey records with her. I'll take my chances." Ruth Alderman watched him walk out. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. It was a Friday evening at the end of the second week when things shifted. In the way that things shift, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet fact that becomes visible when the light changes. Clara was locking the office at 6 o'clock when she turned and found James Whitaker standing at the yard gate with his hat in his hands, and no particular professional reason to be there, because the survey work for that day had concluded at 4. She turned and looked at him and waited. "I finished the eastern section today," he said. "I know," she said. "I signed off on the measurement log. The western boundary is next week," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to walk up to the ridge above the mill," he said. "There's something worth seeing up there this time of evening. I thought if you weren't otherwise occupied." She looked at him. He looked back at her, straightforwardly, without pretending the invitation was something other than what it was. She put the office key in her coat pocket. "I know a better route than the logging road," she said. "It takes 20 minutes. "I have 20 minutes, he said. They went up through the timber on the trail she knew, the one that switchbacked up the north slope through the larch trees, which were going gold now in the September turning, and came out on a shelf of granite that looked west over the valley. The Clark Fork was a silver line below them, and the mountains beyond it were going from orange to purple in the last of the light, and the whole thing had the quality of something that does not require comment, but simply requires you to be present for it. They stood at the edge of the granite shelf and looked at it. "You were right," she said. "I usually know what's worth seeing," he said. She glanced at him. "That's a significant claim. I'll stand by it," he said. He was still looking at the mountains. She looked at the mountains too. "Why survey work?" she said. "I like knowing where things actually are," he said. "Not approximately, precisely." He paused. "Most people are comfortable with approximate." "I'm not," she said. "No," he said. "I could see that from the records." A pause. "The light shifted from orange to something deeper," Clara said, because honesty was her way and she saw no reason to manage it. "People have been talking to you. About me." "Yes," he said. "Mrs. Alderman," she said. It was not a question. "Among others," he said. "And what did they say?" He turned and looked at her directly. "That you were too sharp, too self-sufficient. That you'd turn down 2 men and would turn down any other. That you weren't suited for," he paused. "For partnership," was the word used. She kept her eyes on the mountains. "And what did you think?" "I thought," he said, "that the people saying it were describing the problem wrong. They were saying you were too much. I think what they meant was that they weren't enough, and they called it your problem because it was easier." Clara was quiet. "I also thought," he said, "that I had been in this territory for 2 weeks, and that the most interesting hour of every day had been spent in a lumberyard office in Harlan's Creek, Montana, with a woman who reads appendices." She turned and looked at him. "James," she said. "Yes," he said. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying, he said, that I have met a great many people in 12 years of going wherever the federal government sends me, and I have not once thought that any of them were enough. He turned fully to face her, the mountains and the last of the light behind him. I have been here 2 weeks, and I already think you are more than enough. The town of Harlan's Creek has the whole thing backwards, and I'd like, if you're willing, to be the person who says so clearly. Clara Denton stood on the granite shelf above her family's lumber yard with the Montana evening settling in around her and looked at James Whitaker, who looked back at her with the steady, unperforming attention she had recognized from the first morning. The attention of someone who was not managing her, not measuring her against a standard she hadn't agreed to, not waiting for her to be something smaller. She had known the shape of something without knowing its name. She had stopped looking for it in Harlan's Creek. She had been wrong about that. Ask me something specific, she said. I don't respond well to vague. He almost smiled. Miss Denton, he said, when my work here is finished, I intend to put in a request for a permanent posting in the Montana Territory. I will have a reason for that request that I would like you to know about. In the meantime, may I call on you properly? She held his gaze for a long moment. The Clark Fork glittered below them. The first stars showed over the eastern ridge. You may, she said. He did. October came to Harlan's Creek with the particular quality of Montana autumn, which was not the soft decline of eastern falls, but a sharp, clear beauty that made every morning feel like an argument for staying. The larch trees went from gold to amber to a deep copper, and the air had an edge to it by mid-morning that required a coat, and the evenings came early and went dark fast, and were the kind of evenings that were better shared. James finished the official survey work in the second week of October. He submitted his report to the land office in Helena. He did not leave Harlan's Creek. He had requested an extension for supplementary documentation of the disputed northern parcels, and the land office had granted it, and if the extension was longer than strictly necessary for the supplementary documentation, the Helena office was not in a position to know that. He stayed at the boarding house on Mill Street, and he called on Clara 3 evenings a week at the Denton family home, where her father, a large, quiet man named George, who had the same gray eyes as his daughter, and who had spent 4 years watching the town of Harlan's Creek get his daughter wrong, sat by the fire with a newspaper he had usually already read and made no effort whatsoever to excuse himself. George Denton had formed his opinion of James Whitaker in the first 10 minutes of the first evening call, which was the time it took James to ask him a genuine question about the history of the eastern boundary dispute. Not a polite question, not a courtesy question, but a real one, and to listen to the answer with the same focused attention he brought to survey records. George had gone back to his newspaper after that, but he had not gone to bed until late. Clara and James talked the way people talk when they have both been largely without someone worth talking to. About the survey work and the land records and the territorial disputes that were reshaping the map of Montana faster than the government could document it. About the lumber industry and what would happen to the mountain forests in another 20 years if the harvest rates held. About the law, which Clara knew more of than most people expected, and mathematics, which James used in ways she found genuinely interesting to understand. About her father's back, which had improved, and his opinions, which had not changed since approximately 1860, and which she loved with the specific patience of someone who understands a person completely. About loneliness, eventually, because honest people find their way there. Did you actually like any of it? Clara asked one evening in November, sitting in the front room of the Denton house, while her father's newspaper breathing came from the chair by the fire. The moving. 12 years of it. Parts of it, James said. The work is good work. There's something about being the person who says where the line actually falls, who puts the precise mark on the land and says, this is where one thing ends and another begins. I found that satisfying. He was quiet for a moment. The in-between parts were less satisfying. The in-between parts? Coming back to a boarding house room, he said. Eating supper alone. Not having anyone to tell when I'd seen something worth seeing. She looked at the fire. I know what that is, she said. I know you do, he said. Her father turned a page he had already read. Neither of them mentioned it. There was a morning in November that Clara thought about afterward as the moment she understood the full measure of James Whittaker, though it did not look like a significant moment while it was happening. A delivery had arrived at the lumber yard, a large order of finishing lumber for a building contractor in Billings, and the driver had made an error in the load count. Not a large error, 11 boards short of the contracted quantity. Clara had caught it immediately, as she caught everything, and was in the process of documenting the discrepancy when the driver, a large red-faced man from the Billings company, had decided that the solution to the discrepancy was to explain to Clara, at length and with increasing volume, that her count was wrong and that he had personally loaded this wagon, and he knew what was in it. Clara had the manifest. Clara had the yard count. Clara did not raise her voice. James had come into the yard on his way to the northern parcel he was measuring that morning and had stopped at the gate when he registered the situation. He had not intervened. He had watched. And what he watched was Clara Denton, with the calm of someone who has never needed volume to be correct, show the driver the manifest, show him the yard count, show him the section of the contract that specified the remedy for under-delivery, and conclude the matter without a single word that was not precise and necessary. The driver had left to send a telegram to his company. Clara had turned and noticed James at the gate. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Long enough," he said. She expected him to say something about the situation, to acknowledge it, to check that she was all right, to offer some version of having been ready to step in. He said none of those things. "I'm going to be late to the northern parcel if I don't leave now," he said. "Will you be finished with the yard count by 4? "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll be back by 4. He paused. "The parcel is going to come out exactly as your records say it does. I want you to know that in advance." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. And he went. She stood in the yard for a moment after he left. Then she went back to the manifest. But she was smiling in the specific way she smiled when something turned out to be exactly what it appeared to be. December arrived, and with it the question of what James Whittaker was going to do, because the supplementary survey extension had run its course, and the northern parcel documentation was complete, and the land office in Helena was expecting his return. He had written to request a permanent posting. He had not yet received an answer. The waiting had the quality of something suspended. On a Saturday morning in the second week of December, James arrived at the Denton yard at 7 o'clock with something to show her. He had been out to the northern parcel, the one that abutted the Federal Timber Reserve, the one with the long ridge and the creek that ran through it, and he had taken careful measurements of a specific section, and he had brought the survey drawings to show her. "What am I looking at?" she said, spreading them on the drafting table. "This section here," he said, leaning beside her and indicating a parcel on the eastern edge of the reserve boundary. 340 acres. Currently unclaimed as Federal Reserve land, but the original survey placed the reserve line incorrectly. The actual boundary, per the 1875 resurvey addendum, which most people have not read, is here, she said, pointing to a line 2 inches east of the drawn boundary on his map. He looked at her. "You've read the addendum. I found it in the same appendix as the 1864 amendment," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That 340 acres is available for private claim, Clara. The timber on it is secondary growth, which means it's 15 to 20 years from harvest ready. The creek is good water. The soil on the lower sections is agricultural." He looked at her steadily. "I filed a preliminary notice of survey correction with the land office 2 weeks ago. I wanted you to know before the notice became public." She looked at the drawings. She understood what he was telling her, not just about the land, but about the kind of attention it required to find it, and the kind of person who would bring it to her before anyone else knew. "James," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you filing a land claim?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm considering it," he said. "The land office posting came through last week. Permanent position, based in Helena, with regional work in the territory." He looked at the drawings and then at her. "I would need a reason to be based in Harlan's Creek instead of Helena. The posting allows for regional discretion in base location." A pause. I'm looking for a compelling geographic reason. Clara looked at the survey drawings for a long moment. The creek ran through the middle of the parcel in a clean line. 340 acres of land that most people had not read carefully enough to know was there. That's a thin pretext, she said. I know, he said. I'm a surveyor. I can usually find a better one. He turned and looked at her. But I find I don't want to pretend with you. I don't see the point. She looked at him. The December morning light came in through the office window, and the yard was quiet, and the mountains were white above the tree line, and everything was the color of something precise and clear. George, she said, loudly enough to be heard in the next room. The sound of her father's chair moving. He appeared in the doorway. Clara, he said. Mr. Whitaker has something to tell you, she said. James Whitaker looked at Clara Denton. He looked at George Denton. He said what he had come to say, which was direct and clear, and exactly long enough, and not one word longer. George looked at his daughter. Clara looked back at her father. He had known her for 26 years, and he had watched this town handle her like something they didn't know what to do with for all 26 of those years. And he had kept his counsel about it because Clara didn't need defending, and he knew it, but he had not been without opinions. George Denton held James Whitaker's gaze for a long moment. Then he said, You read appendices? As a professional habit, James said. Good, George said, and went back to his chair. They were married in March, when the Clark Fork was running high with snowmelt, and the larch trees were just beginning to bud, and the whole territory had the specific feeling of something starting that intended to last. The ceremony was small. Clara had no patience for elaborate and James no inclination for performance, and the combination produced exactly the event they both wanted, which was the one where the actual thing happened, and the surrounding noise didn't. Harlan's Creek attended. Because Harlan's Creek attended everything, and because there was an additional quality of interest in attending the wedding of a woman the town had privately concluded would never marry, and a man who had, apparently, not received or not been persuaded by the town's conclusion on the subject. Ruth Alderman, who stood near the back and cried in the practical, unsentimental way of people who cry at things they are genuinely moved by, told anyone who would listen afterward that she had thought all along that Clara just needed the right person. She said this with complete sincerity and without any apparent memory of the conversation at the post office. That was all right. Clara didn't hold it against her. The two men who had briefly and unsuccessfully courted Clara Denton, the Helena timber buyer, and the rancher's son from 20 miles east, were not present, being in other places, which was appropriate and unremarkable, and exactly as it should be. George Denton sat in the front row. He had his hat on his knees and his big hands folded, and he did not try to contain what he felt when the moment came, which was considerable and had been accumulating for some time. James Whitaker took the permanent regional posting with the Montana Territorial Land Office and based himself in Harlan's Creek, which the Helena office found mildly unusual, but did not question, because James Whitaker's survey work was accurate to a degree that made the office's dispute resolution caseload drop noticeably, and you did not argue with a surveyor who found the right line every time. Clara ran the Denton Lumber Company and the Denton accounts, and, gradually, the claim management for 3 neighboring operations whose owners had discovered that Clara Whitaker, she kept Denton on the company sign because it had been her father's name on it since 1861, and she saw no need to change what was true, understood land rights, with a precision that saved them money and settled disputes before they became expensive. She and James walked the northern parcel on Sunday mornings, the 340 acres of secondary timber and good creek water, and talked about what it might become in 20 years when the trees were ready, which was the kind of conversation that presupposes you will both be there to see it. Harlan's Creek revised its opinion about Clara in the way that small towns revise opinions, not with any formal announcement, not with any acknowledgement that there had been an opinion worth revising, but simply by the gradual replacement of one set of observations with another. She was, and this was said with the specific warmth, that communities reserve for people who have found their proper place in the order of things exactly right for each other, which she had always been. It had simply taken a man who read appendices to know it, and to say so, and to mean it precisely. Sometimes the world labels us before we've had the chance to introduce ourselves too sharp, too much, too difficult to place. But somewhere out there is a person who reads the appendices, who looks past the town's verdict, straight to the truth of you, and finds you not overwhelming, but simply enough. Don't let the loudest voices convince you to take up less space than you were built for. A small note for you: this story was imagined and written by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment and leave you with something warm to carry into your day.